The Summer Showdown Tournament is on the horizon as the last of the qualifying matches are played. The teams that have a handle on the current meta are making it clear as there was not too many close games this week. But with this week done, we are that much closer to the end of the season. Hey guys, how's it going? My name's always and welcome to the Overwatch League Weekly Recap. In this video, we'll be going over the matches for the given week, partially to talk about how all the teams are faring, but mostly to see how my preseason predictions match up to reality. As such, there is a full spoiler warning for this week's games, so if you haven't seen them, you may want to wait on this video. But seeing how this video is being made and uploaded long after the season is already over, you've probably already seen the games, so this spoiler warning is mostly moot. Anyways, we'll be looking at all of the scores and how they match up to what I thought before the season even started. So before we begin, let's get this out there. This video took a fair bit of time to make, much longer than I expected, and well, the 2022 season has already begun. Now, I still plan on finishing the videos for the rest of the 2021 season, and it's going to take some time, but originally I had planned to get a recap video for the overall season out by now. That didn't happen, so I'm going to address something here. The new season features the Overwatch 2 beta is not something that I plan on covering here on the channel like I have/am for the 2021 season. Big reasons. One, I don't really have the time to put in the effort, and I'm already behind on making these videos, so I don't really need to add more. And more importantly, I'm in the camp that's a bit wary on 5v5. I know it's a controversial change in the community, and I'm of the opinion that 5v5 is a bad change. I've played the beta, I've watched the games in the new season, and I just don't know that I could have the interest like I had when Overwatch was 6v6. It just feels like deathmatch to me, and there are other games that already have that style, and if I wanted to play or watch or make videos on that, I would have already. But I don't. So expect the rest of the 2021 season videos for the Overwatch League. I'll get them out as I can. But don't expect anything from me for the 2022 season on the current 5v5 patch. I'm not interested, and that's that. With that out of the way, let's get into things. Before we get into the scores, there were technically some roster changes this week, but a coaching addition for Shanghai and a two-way contract for Guangzhou is not too interesting to talk about. So let's just get to the scores this week. Lots of 3-0s, especially in the West. This week was not too bad for my predictions, got a majority of the games right even if I didn't get many scorelines correct. 3 this week out of the 14 I got completely right, with Washington Justice having no trouble 3-0ing the London Spitfire, the Toronto Defiant only getting one map off of Dallas in a 3-1 victory for the Fuel, and I correctly predicted Shanghai cleaning up the Valiant 3-0. Most of the games this week I just got the scorelines wrong. Starting in the West, Atlanta Reign were able to defeat both London and Boston 3-0, whereas I thought London would get at least a map off of Atlanta, and Boston would make a close game 3-2. I also thought that Toronto would manage to get a map off of the Gladiators, but Gladiators were able to win 3-0. And finally in the West, I thought Houston would get a map off of Dallas, but again, a 3-0 to the Fuel. And in the East, 3 games with the correct victor, but wrong scores. Hangzhou Spark had a much tougher time against NYXL than I thought, going to map 5 in a game I thought would be a 3-1, and the Spark were not able to do as much against the Shanghai Dragons, losing 3-1 in a game that I thought would be 5 maps. And I gave the LA Valiant way too much credit, giving the Valiant a map against the Hunters when Chengdu cleaned up 3-0. Now for the upsets. Not too many, only 4. In the West, Boston shocked everyone, winning 3-0 against the Houston Outlaws, in a game that I gave to Houston 3-1. And a game I thought would go to 5 did, but the Washington Justice were able to edge out the Los Angeles Gladiators 3-2. In the East, Philly disappointed me, losing both games I predicted that they would win, a close game against the Chengdu Hunters, losing 3-2 when I predicted a 3-1 victory to the Fusion, and then losing to the NYXL 3-1 in a game that I thought Philly would have no trouble with, winning 3-0. All in all, though, not a bad week for predictions. Starting off in the East, we have the Chengdu Hunters going 2-0, first against the Philadelphia Fusion in a reverse sweep 3-2, and then an easy match against the Los Angeles Valiant 3-0. Chengdu is an odd team. They always have been. But after losing Elsa last week, Late Young has become their only off-tank, and that's created a bit of an interesting situation. See, this week, Chengdu mainly played Amang on main tank, only bringing Gaga in for the last 2 maps against the Valiant. And if I had to guess why, as most people, including myself, see Gaga as the better main tank, it's probably because of the experience Amang and Late Young have together from playing on Chengdu for the last year or so, whereas Gaga is the new addition. Take synergies are important, and Chengdu probably feel that Amang works better right now with Late Young more than Gaga does. But with that being said, apart from limiting what Chengdu can run as Among primarily just plays the ball, he did just fine and Late Young was not too bad looking either. Could Chengdu have handled Philly better if Gaga was playing? Maybe, but we'll never know. Either way, Jinmu and Leaf looked great this week, as did Monk and Faraway on support, Faraway having an excellent Zen and Monk doing work on the BAP. This is a good team. A weird one, but definitely one of the top in the East. Next up, the Shanghai Dragons unsurprisingly went 2-0 this week, a nice easy 3-0 over the Los Angeles Valiant, and a little bit closer match against the Hangzhou Spark, winning that one 3-1. This team is a powerhouse, mostly playing the ball dive and mostly dominating. Lip on the Sombra is a bit inconsistent with the EMPs, but sometimes getting massive ones, other times just completely missing, but Lip builds the ult so fast that it doesn't really matter. I've said this multiple times before. Fleta looks great no matter what he's playing, and the tank line is solid as usual. The only really bad thing I can say about the Dragons this week is stop playing Molly. So Molly is Shanghai's other flex support, typically playing the Zen, and played in both matches this week, only on control I believe, which is fine in general. Molly is a good player and does deserve the playtime, but Izayaki is the better choice for this team, and I'd like to see the roster not really change for Shanghai, as we are getting close to the end of the season. It's not really a big complaint, but it's the best I could come up with this team. Seriously, Shanghai is no doubt the best in the East. Next, going 1-1 this week, we have the Hangzhou Spark. Hangzhou had a tough week this week, first in the slugfest against New York Excelsior, winning that match out 3-2, and then losing to the Shanghai Dragons 3-1. Hangzhou continues to look like one of the better teams in the East, but is still having some issues finding wins, at least easily. So let's start with the good. Shai looks fantastic. Whether on the Tracer or the McCree, Shai is a dangerous part of this team and does without a doubt have that carrier potential. This tank line is solid. Gushue in particular shines on the Winston and is probably one of the best Winstons in the league apart from someone like Fearless of the Dallas Fuel. And MCD is a great off support, usually playing the Ana to Nano Gushue, and had some highlights this week, but is also just so quick at building the Nano. Lots of good, but this team is still struggling. Individually, the other two DPS really don't hold up to Shai's level. Architect, who primarily plays the Tracer, is not bad, but not as good as Shai is at the same heroes, and Zominsu is a decent Sombra, but holds onto the EMP way too long, when just kind of slows down the team when he's playing the dive comps. And I think that's this team's biggest problem, coordination. The Spark really struggled to get set up cleanly, and while the dives are usually good when they go for it, it just takes too long. This team feels indecisive, and even worse, they have a bad habit of ulting late into fights, throwing away EMPs or nanos, and just making everything harder for themselves. This team has talent, but something is not gelling well enough for the Spark to utilize the players and get the wins. The New York Excelsior go 1-1 this week, getting a nice 3-1 win over the Philadelphia Fusion, and a close 3-2 loss to the Hangzhou Spark. This team is actually looking halfway decent, and definitely is one of the teams that likes playing more of the dive style, playing a lot of the ball with either Sigma or Diva. So let's start with the good. Kalios on the off tank really impressed this week, eating a lot of pulse bombs and even a couple of blizzards. Kalios was in the league in the inaugural season, playing for Boston, but dropped down to contenders for a couple of years before returning, and while he's definitely improved, still nowhere near the top level in the off tank role. But this week, Kalios looked solid, and I feel that deserves some praise. The real stars from New York is the DPS line, with Flora doing a lot, usually on the Tracer, and Guangbu actually doing well on the hit scans. Feather is also looking good, especially on the Echo, and honestly, this is a decent team. So why 1-1? Well, the main reason for that is experience. This team feels young. Sure, there's plenty of veterans, Jonak, Yakpung, technically Kalios, but this team makes a lot of mistakes, and in general is a bit... it just takes a bit to get things set up and going for their dives. That's not to say New York isn't aggressive, which is a common problem for teams that are slow to the dive, but it seems like there's just a little bit of more communication problem than anything. I honestly think New York just doesn't have a leader to command the team, so there's a lot of hesitation. Other than that, Friday on the Brig is a little inconsistent, and a lot of the ball comps, you play Zen with a Brig, and the Brig's job is to protect the Zen. Jonak is a fantastic Zen, but he kept having to switch off to the Ana, which is a little bit more stable with the sleep and the Bionade, and that's a reflection of Friday on the Brig. Otherwise, the support line does look decent, and this is a team that, while probably not going to challenge the top teams in the East, could be the kingmaker for who squeaks into the tournaments. The Philadelphia Fusion had a rough week, going 0-2, being the only team to ruin both of my predictions and lose to both the Chengdu Hunters and New York Excelsior. Now, the Hunters game was close, 3-2, but it was a reverse sweep, and against the New York Excelsior, Philly lost 3-1. This is a team I had a lot of higher hopes for, but something is going wrong. I mean, this team has a good record. While Chengdu is a tough team to play, as you never know what they're going to do, Philly is a team full of experienced top-tier players. They should be able to handle a team like New York. So let's start with the good. First, the support line is still one of my favorites in the league. Alarm is so good whether it's on the Zen or the BAP, and Funny Astro is consistent, always shining on the Lucio. Carpe, while a little quiet this week, is always doing a lot, and his Symmetra looks fantastic. But here's the thing, the tank line is solid, but not super impressive, at least not this week, and the other DPS, whether it's EQO or Rascal, is always a lot more inconsistent. EQO has some good plays this week, but also sat on Genji trying to farm Blade for 2 team fights, doing next to nothing on a flank angle. Rascal is a fantastic Mei, but tends to get his blizzards eaten a bit too often. And ult in general is a bad subject for Philly, be it overusing ult or just not getting any follow-up and having to invest more and more to eventually lose the team fight. It's just such a momentum shift that it's hard for the team to recover. And finally, at least this week, Philly really struggled with team comps, wanting so much to play the Rhine Rush or Double Shield with the Sim TPing them everywhere, which, don't get me wrong, did work at times, but it's just hard to win a fight out cleanly enough to get the progress on the objective when you TP, get a single pick onto the opponent that can back off quickly, and have to poke from a distance while you wait for TP to come back off of cooldown. This is especially bad when you're playing these types of comps that on attack, as the other team has no problem allowing you to waste your time. Philly needs to clean up their gameplay. They have the talent, they just need to be smart about comp choices, ult usage, and in general just be more consistent. There's potential here, but this week it was wasted. And finally, the Los Angeles Valiant went 0-2 this week to no one's surprise, getting 3-0'd by both the Shanghai Dragons and the Chengdu Hunters. Now, to be fair, those are both really good teams. This was a tough week for the Valiant, and LA was able to take a point off of Shanghai in control, so that's a win, right? In all seriousness, this team is clearly out of their league, and this week was no exception. Let's start with the good. Molaran is a fantastic player. Molanran, however you say his name, still makes mistakes, but is a bright spot for this team. Wea was also pretty decent on both the Ana and the Zen. Crystal is usually inconsistent on DPS, but this week actually looked good. I was never a big fan of Crystal when he played on Hangzhou and Guangzhou, but I'll admit that he had his moments this week. The tanks even had their moments that looked good. Silver 3's Ryan actually did work. But Valiant have next to no team play, constantly get picked and delayed, and while there are bright spots for a lot of this team, they're few and far between, with maybe Molanran being the exception, as he's usually playing well. But it's not enough to even take a map wins, let alone match wins. And I get it. Chengdu and Shanghai are tough competition, the best in the East and arguably better than most in the West. But this is a team I think is safe to say is going to struggle even getting points. Wins are just out of the question. Moving on to the West, the Atlanta Reign finished up this week 2-0, winning against both the London Spitfire as expected and the Boston Uprising, and winning both matches 3-0. Atlanta looks strong, still not playing any dive, but playing a lot more double shield than the Orisa Diva or Rhine comps that the Reign have enjoyed before. Reign did have a little trouble with a very odd comp attacking Hollywood A against Boston with the Rhine Zarya Reaper Torb up against the Boston Dive, but Atlanta recognized that it wasn't working and made the swaps, maybe a little late, but it was still enough to take the point and eventually win out the map. I like the aggression from the Reign, and Pelican continues to shine on DPS. Hawk is the hidden gem on this team, doing so much work on the off-tank, and I really don't have much negative to say about this team. Some people might not like the BM on King's Row against London, but hey, it's all fun. Sometimes not capping the point makes for a more interesting game than quickly capping. This is a team that's looking strong in this meta, and while they might not have the most highlights, they get the wins. Dallas Fuel also go 2-0 for the week, defeating both the Houston Outlaws 3-0 and the Toronto Defiant 3-1. Dallas continues to look strong, playing some odd comps, including the rare double shield, but a lot of Ryan Rush and dive comps, and nearly going perfect this week apart from one map loss to Toronto. That was King's Row, and Dallas decided to play dive against double shield. Usually, that's not going to work. And it didn't. Until the very next map against Toronto. See, Dallas looks good, especially at the dive, and Ryan Rush, since that's practically the same thing with the Reinhardt. But Dallas needs to control the tempo of the match. Dallas is very good at unbalancing a team, being aggressive and not letting the other team set up anything, or just causing chaos through holding W. When Dallas do not control the tempo of the game, and the game slows down a lot, Dallas struggles. And that's how Toronto won the map against Dallas. They slowed down the dive attack and allowed themselves time to set things up to deal with every attack Dallas threw at the Defiant. But overall, I don't have too much bad to say about the Dallas Fuel. Sure, they overextend sometimes and pay for it, but that's to be expected from an aggressive team. And yeah, Dallas sometimes throw away ults that could turn a lost fight, but it's usually a pulse bomb or something similar that builds quickly, or is just not that important. Look, Dallas is strong. There are so many good players on this team, and despite the DPS getting a lot of praise, the hero this week was Fielder, who is pretty much a beast, especially on the Baptiste. Fielder was getting amped Matrix every fight, and was even lapping the ult charge of Toronto's Baptiste Lastro. This team is good, and they look like one of the teams to beat right now. This is the Dallas meta. Finally, for the 2-0 teams, the Washington Justice went from one extreme to the other, first with a relatively easy 3-0 match against the London Spitfire, and then a fight against the Los Angeles Gladiators, getting the win in 5-3-2. This Justice team likes playing the Rhine Rush and mostly the ball dive, though with some other comps like the double bubble and classic Winston dive. But Rhine comps and ball comps is where this team looks great. Mag on the main tank is a fantastic Rhine and can play both ball and Winston just fine too. But the main story for this team is the DPS, Decay and Assassin. Decay is deadly, particularly on the Tracer, but has a solid Symmetra too, and Assassin is dangerous on the Mei and a great Sombra as well. These two can turn fights so easily, and Decay on Tracer is so patient, preferring to one-clip opponents and save the Pulse Bomb for when he needs to retreat, dealing the absolute maximum damage. Assassin's Mei is deadly with the accuracy he hits the icicles, and his Mei walls are usually superb. However, there is a bit of a problem with these two, and that is their consistency. Decay is either filling the kill feed or constantly getting picked, and there is no middle ground. An Assassin doesn't always make the best decisions with ults, and also has a habit of overextending. Washington has a problem being aggressive. This team really prefers to counter ult or win fights defensively, letting the other team come to them, or to just focus on the poke and get picks that way. That doesn't always work, and that's usually how the Justice lose fights. Seeing this team be proactive is rare, but they will need to do it more often if they want to be a top team. This team has the talent, they just need the consistency and aggression if they want to be the champions. Boston this week surprised a lot of people, myself included, getting a win over Houston to go 1-1 for the week after losing to Atlanta. Boston looks decently good. Very obviously, Boston wants to play dive, with Mungbong playing the Ana. Who wouldn't love to see that? Seriously, Mungbong might be one of, if not the best Ana in the league, not only at building nanos pretty much every fight, but also just getting really nasty bionades. Punk is also looking fantastic as always, being a superb off-tank, but despite winning easily against the struggling Houston Outlaws, Boston themselves struggled against Atlanta. This team's biggest weakness is probably the inconsistencies from the DPS line, and Stan 1 occasionally diving in too deep, though I think the DPS are the bigger problem. And don't get me wrong, both Valentine and I'm37 have had moments where they shine, but they are still making a lot of mistakes. I'm37's Tracer likes to blow himself up, and Valentine is playing a little bit too much Genji for my liking, diving in and trying to blade only to instantly get deleted. I'd much rather see I'm37 playing more hit scan and Valentine playing more echo, to be honest, as they look a lot more comfortable on those picks. Granted, I get the comp doesn't always allow for the hit scan, and there's no reason that Valentine can't just play the echo if Boston wants to continue playing dive. Which they should. Their dive looks fantastic. Good coordination, and Mungbong is fantastic. This team is definitely knocking on the door to the top of the West, but I don't think they're there quite yet, and I don't think that they can handle the top teams just yet. But Boston might be one of the best middle-of-the-pack teams so far. The LA Gladiators also went 1-1 this week, having a nice easy 3-0 against the Toronto Defiant before having the slugfest that was the match against the Washington Justice, losing 3-2. It's hard to lose that close of a match against the Justice, even if the last map, Busan, went the distance. But all in all, a decent week for the Gladiators. This team likes playing the dive, specifically the Winston dive, but also a little ball dive, and will occasionally play the Rhine Rush, but definitely prefers dive. Which is good, as this team looks aggressive, Maybe not as aggressive as like Dallas, but still, the Gladiators can look best when they are in control of the tempo and can dive the backline consistently. This team is really good about alt cycling, and Kevsters continues to be a menace on the Tracer, and with Shu in the backline, the Gladiators have a third DPS. And I'll always sing the praises of Space on the off tank, but to be fair, this week he was solid and consistent, but not really any major highlights. That's fine. Doing your job is the most important thing. So what's there to criticize? This team just really struggles up against the good Washington Justice team, specifically their DPS, and that's it, right? Well, actually mostly. A little bit of comp issues, as the Gladiators really can't play the Rhine Rush depending on who's subbed in. Specifically Skewed versus Moth, as Skewed pretty much only plays Brig, and Moth is the Lucio player. So if Moth is subbed out, no Rhine Rush, which sucks, but it is what it is. The other complaint I have is less of a complaint, more of an observation, and that is Birdring had a tough game against Washington on the Sombra. 2 bad EMPs on Gibraltar, I think. One completely missing and one getting stunned is rough, but Birdring is generally very good, and it's just a little bit of a bad day, I think. Because honestly, the Gladiators are a really good team. Consistently near the top of the rankings and work well together, they just need to figure out how to deal with what their opponents are throwing at them a little faster and learn to set the tempo against the top teams. Gladiators are still one of the best in the West. Houston is a surprising 0-2 this week, losing in a bit of an upset to Boston Uprising and to their longtime rivals in the Dallas Fuel. Despite losing both matches 3-0, Houston didn't look completely lost, just a little lost. Like, both of these matches were close, lots of back and forth fights, and the Outlaws were even able to get a draw from the Fuel. But it was just never enough to win out. Against Boston, the Outlaws played exclusively Orisa comps, and played both Dive and Orisa against Dallas, but the comps just didn't work. To be fair to Houston, Boston playing the Dive looked very strong this week, and the Orisa comps were slow and easily taken advantage of. And when those same Orisa comps went up against the Rhine comps of Dallas, Houston just couldn't handle the brawl. I'd really love to see Houston try to play some of the Rhine comps again, as they did look really good at those earlier this season, but Jungler seems to be struggling at the dive. His Winston isn't bad, but he does tend to dive too deep and get picked a lot. It's hard being a main tank, but just staying alive is such a boon for your team. And speaking of struggling to stay alive, Juby also has that problem, getting picked so much. But not all is bad for Houston. Piggy continues to look great, and both Dante and Happy are solid, and Crimzo continues to impress, especially on the Ana. This team just needs to finish fights better, preferably with fewer ults, and be a bit quicker in their plays. Houston had a tough week, but if they can shake it off, they'll be fine in the long run. Toronto Defiant struggled this week, going 0-2 against the LA Gladiators and the Dallas Fuel. Though Toronto was the only other team apart from the Gladiators who lost a game but still took a map this week in the West. So I guess that's a positive. So let's start there, the positives. Honestly, there wasn't too much good, but Aspire continues to shine for this team. In particular on the Tracer, and Sato playing the ball against Dallas worked really well setting up the dives with Aspire. In general, Sato looked decent, and the support line for Toronto is solid. Not necessarily the best in the league, but certainly not a glaring weakness or anything. Even Michelle on the off-tank was decent this week, though Michelle does have a habit of getting picked off early. So what went wrong for the Defiant? Well, first of all, they went up against some stiff competition in the Gladiators and the Fuel. But the big problem, or at least one of them, is that this team is slow, which is okay for the double shield style comps, but not for the dive or double bubble, but I'll get back to the double bubble. Toronto's dive is just so slow setting up, they'd probably miss out on 2 or 3 fights if they just picked up the pace setting up. Part of that might be Hisu when he's playing Sombra. I feel like I've complained about Hisu Sombra before, and it's not that it's bad, because Hisu is actually a competent Sombra, except when it comes to using EMP. I feel like Hisu is just looking for that perfect opportunity, that huge game-winning EMP, and just waits, sitting on the EMP. It's not like Hisu doesn't know how to use EMP, because his defensive EMPs are great, usually. He just doesn't grasp the aggressive EMP, and I think Toronto would be a lot better if at the dive if they just threw the EMP away a little bit more. And be willing to take a less than ideal EMP. Get an EMP cancel, whatever, just use it. Build another. But the other issue that Toronto had this week was in playing the double bubble comp. And for this comp, they needed a Zarya player, and rather than keeping Michelle in the game, Toronto decided to bring in their specialist Aztac. Cool, fine. The problem is, Aztac seemingly only plays the Zarya. And honestly, he's not very good. I kind of hate saying that, but the Zarya gameplay was very lackluster. I'd rather see Michelle in the game, even if his Zarya is worse somehow, just for the possibility of a switch if the comp isn't working. But the big problem I had with Aztec was more his survival instinct, which is non-existent. I'm exaggerating, but against the Gladiators, which is the only time we really saw Aztec, on 2 different maps, Toronto needed to hold A, both Anubis and Eichenwald. And the story was pretty much the same for both of those maps. Gladiators played dive, immediately got a pick onto Aztec, and won. That was it. You can't bring a specialist in and let that happen, not once, but twice. Please, Toronto, don't play Aztec again. No offense to the player, but sometimes versatility and survivability is more important than hero comfort. But overall, I've talked too much about this team. Rough week, but I still think Toronto is on the higher end of the middle of the pack. They generally look good, just not against the top teams. London go 0-2 this week, and honestly, given their opponents, both Atlanta Reign and Washington Justice, it's not too surprising. It was a tough week, and while there is still a lot of bad to talk about with this team, there's also some good. Let's start with that. First of all, Sparker has shown some real potential in these games, particularly when he's playing the Hanzo or McCree. He looks good. He still looks like a young player, making some mistakes, but overall, I look forward to his career. He should be good. The other big thing I liked about London this week was a really weird comp they've tried to play in a couple of times. So it's mostly the Rhine Rush, but with Ball instead of the Diva. And Molfig, or is it Molf1G, whichever, Molf on the ball looks really good. Like, the Justice struggled against the comp in a very close Eichenwald map this week. But unfortunately for London, they struggle in finishing maps, and there were a few glaring issues I saw. Honestly, these are things that London have struggled with all year. First of all, when the comp London wants to run doesn't work, they run their heads into the wall. They do the same things, make no switches, and good teams don't even break a sweat. Once a team has figured out what you're trying to do and can easily stop it, try something else. Something about insanity or something. Whether this is a coaching thing, where the coaches are telling Spitfire they're not allowed to do anything else or what, it needs to change. Give the team a chance and adapt. Along with this, Blase and Hadi are definitely glaring weak spots. Both want to play their comfort picks, Blase on the Doom and Junk, Hadi on the Rhine, and while Blase's Doom does okay in these comps, the Junk does not, and he needs to switch once it doesn't work. Hadi, on the other hand, wants to play Rhine, and gets MTD'd by better Rhine players like Mag. Or Hadi tries to force the Rhine against Double Shield, like all of what Atlanta was playing, and it's just not going to work. Hadi needs to be willing to play the ball, or Winston, or just play more Orisa. Rhine is not always going to work. And finally, stop throwing away ults. Blase and Ripa are the biggest culprits, with Hadi sort of always throwing away Rhine ults just due to the comp differences. But Ripa needs to be more mindful of the amp matrix placement, and Blase needs to stop throwing blizzards when the fight is over. These are good ults. They can be used in the next fight to gain advantages. London had a really rough week this week, and if things continue to look this bad, they won't get a win this season. And with that, the qualifiers of the Summer Showdown are completed. In the next video, we'll be looking at the knockouts and tournament for the Summer Showdown as we crown yet another champion. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'll be working on these when I get the time, so no idea when to expect the next video, but I will still be making it and I will upload it when it's done. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!